From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead for you today, K-State's Gregg Ibendahl will report on his brand new analysis of Kansas Farm Management Association net farm income trends from 2011 to 2020. He was interested specifically here in negative net farm income patterns and whether some farms' incomes are habitually in the red. He'll talk about those interesting findings. Then K-State's Mike Kleinhenz will discuss his latest research on feeding industrial hemp to cattle, essentially as a stress reliever. He's discovered that short-term feeding of hemp can be healthful to cattle during stressful events. And standing by with another Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus van Der Hoeven. All that is coming up on this Agriculture Today. You are listening to Agriculture Today. As always, we're glad to have you tuned in. Well, once more, we're going to tap into that reservoir of great information that is provided yearly by the Kansas Farm Management Association out of Kansas State University. It depicts net farm income trends, among other things. Our guest regularly works with that data and analyzes several aspects of it on the go, and we'll talk about his latest effort today. Gregg Ibendahl is a farm management economist, K-State Research and Extension. What you've done here, Gregg, is explored tendencies for farms to actually have net farm income below zero, in the negative territory, and over a time span which we'll explain. But before we get further along into this, you might remind us of the KFMA income reporting process which generates the information.
Well, you know, the KFMA program has been around for a long time. They've been actually helping farmers for about 80 years. So what we do is we have a group of farms in the state we work with, and any farm is free to join. And basically we have, one specialized economist that works with probably up to 100 farms. And what they're doing is they provide individual service and record keeping and management advice for these producers. So it's a great resource for producers to not only get their tax work done, but also get some management advice.
And it's, again, a great source of information for the in-depth kind of analysis which we'll talk about today. In your words, would you explain your intent with this particular work?
Well, this came about because of some questions I had about the data. So we actually have computerized data that goes back probably 45 years or so. So we go back to the mid-'70s for data. And you go back and you look at the net farm income that we calculate each year and then look at the averages. I noticed every year, even in the very best years, we always have a group of farms that have negative net farm income. Now, with farming, there's a lot of factors that go into that. A lot of it's outside the producer's control. So, things like weather and crop prices have a big effect on what actually happens from year to year. So it's not unusual to see net farm income vary quite a bit from year to year, not only among farms, but within a farm too. So we see this big variation in net farm income. But every year, even in the really good years, we always have a subset of farms that have negative net farm income. I mean, if you look at, last year was a really good year. When I say last year, I mean 2020, when we actually have data for. That was a very good year for farm profitability. We still had 9% of farms that had negative net farm income, which I was kind of surprised about. And then if you look at one of the poorer years, like 2015, we had 40% of the farms that were losing money. So my question was, when I looked at our data, we have farms lose money every year. Is this the same set of farms? Because otherwise, I don't think they could stay in business. So my hypothesis was it was probably going to be a different set of farms every year that were actually losing money.
But you did want to see which farms have a penchant for that, if it's a repetitive thing with some operations here. We won't go into the math, so to say, and how you put the pieces together in depth as far as the economic analysis, but you came up with some interesting findings in as far as percentages of farms which experience a negative net farm income.
Yeah, so to make this really a fair comparison, I really can't just use the available farms every year because we have farms drop in and drop out. So if I just use all the raw data of the available farms, I would probably get a misleading number. So to make sure to account for that, I actually went through and looked at a subset of farms. We call it a panel data, which means we looked at the same set of farms over a 10-year period. So we looked basically from the period 2011 to 2020. And when we looked at, what happened in each individual year, and then I took all the net farm income from all those farms and averaged them together and looked at that overall average of what the net farm income was, and then see how many of those farms, their 10-year average was actually below zero.
Let's take a look at the wide view here, comprehensively over those 10 years, and this was what, from 2011 to 2020?
Yes, that's correct.
You found that there are good years and a few down years in this respect then, right?
Yeah, I think this was a really good time period to look at, that period 2011 to 2020, because from 2011 to about 2014, we had some pretty good profitability years in there. And then, 2015, we kind of had the bottom drop out of our net farm income. In fact, 2015 was actually one of the worst years we have ever had in the KFMA for farm profitability. But then every year since 2015, it has kind of started improving slowly. Every year has been higher since. So 2020 was really a good profitable year. So this is really a good mix of years. We had some down years and some good years and some things in between. So I think it made a good set of years to look at during this analysis.
But then you went deeper and you looked at those individual farms and whether they tend to lean to a positive or a negative net farm income over that time horizon, correct?
Yeah, so looking at this 10-year set of history here, in any individual year, the lowest year that we had for lowest percent of farms that were below negative zero net farm income was 2011, when we had 7.6% of our farms earned less than zero, and then again it went up to 40% in 2015 and back to 9% in 2020. So I was thinking, okay, if I look at the overall average and I find the overall average is lower than the lowest individual year, that probably is a good indication that we have a different set of farms that are losing money every year.
And you found that very thing, you said?
Yes, we did. We found that only, if you take the 10-year average of all farms, that only 5.5% of those farms had a 10-year average below zero. And again, the overall average itself wasn't too negative anyway. So most of our farms actually had a 10-year positive net farm income.
So you come to the conclusion that it may not necessarily be the same farms over and over posting negative net farm incomes?
No, I don't really think it is. I think it is a different set of farms. I think things like weather and pricing and marketing decisions have an influence on what happens with the net farm income that kind of changes a farmer's ability to earn a profit in any given year. So that varies from year to year. Farmers, sometimes they're good at marketing, sometimes they're not. Just depends on, kind of when they pull the trigger sometimes. So that kind of, all those kind of things came into play, as well as weather variations across the state. And it turns out, most years farmers will make money, but, there's probably going to be a couple years in there where they are going to lose money.
You note in your write-up there may be other variables at work here, too, that need to be considered in this analysis. One of those would be the appreciation in land values over time? Yeah,
so even though, if you look at my results for this, and I have a histogram of that, but you're looking at the number of years that farms actually did earn negative net farm income, by far and away, the majority of those farms only earn negative net farm income either 0 years or 1 year and then maybe 2 years. That's probably about 2/3 of our farms. There's really only a handful of farms in that whole situation that earn negative net farm income from, let's say, 5 years or more. And again, there could be some other factors at play. We always say as an economist, that farmers have a goal of maximizing profit. That's probably a true statement for, I would say, the great majority of the farmers in the state and across the country. But there are a few farmers out there that may have other criteria that they're looking at as well here. Maybe they have a goal of maybe meeting some level of net farm income, and after that, they're not quite so concerned about their net farm income. So you may have some farmers out there that, maybe they want to drive the newest equipment and have the shiniest paint out there. Maybe they're looking at some lifestyle things. So there's probably a couple of farmers out there like that, and that might explain some of those other things. But then, as you mentioned, there's some other factors that's not really factored into the net farm income calculation. That would be things like equity appreciation on their land. So even though a farm may have had, those couple of farms that may have had negative net farm income in 7 years, that's not factoring in the land appreciation in that.
Something else to consider as well. These are records from Kansas Farm Management Association member farms. By definition, they tend to be well managed, otherwise they wouldn't be participating in the KFMA. So maybe that's something to be contemplated when we think about overall net farm income, irrespective of membership here.
Yes, that's definitely a factor to consider because, I'm looking at, how well did farmers survive this 10-year period? Well, by definition, I chose farms that definitely did survive that 10-year period. So I'm probably underestimating on that side of things. Probably are a few higher farms that are actually in trouble. But because I did only choose farms that were in our system the entire 10 years. If a farm wasn't maybe doing in good shape, they may have dropped out of our KFMA program. So that definitely is a limitation to be aware of when you look at this paper.
So, Gregg, what is the main takeaway you hope will be drawn from this work?
Well, I think there's really two things. I think if you just look at the individual yearly numbers, I don't think that really paints a good story because of so much variation that you get. And we really don't account for the land appreciation either in the whole thing. So I think you need to watch out for those as you look at these results, too.
Very good. He's put together a write-up which gets into all the details of the analysis, how he arrived at his findings here on the agmanager.info website. It's entitled A 10-Year Analysis of Net Farm Income based on the years 2011 through 2020 and Kansas Farm Management Association records of the farms that he examined there. And as a matter of fact, Gregg, you are working on yet another analysis angle?
Well, this last year with all the interest rate hikes that we've seen and higher interest rates coming up, it made me think that maybe debt's going to become more important on KFMA farms. So I'm kind of working on a new paper right now actually examining that. I mean, if you just look at our current debt-to-asset ratios from KFMA farms, they're as low as they've ever been. But I think there's a lot of stuff hiding behind that farmers need to be aware of, and I'm going to examine that and look at the actual change in asset values versus the amount of debt change on a farm as well here. And I think those are going to be very interesting results.
Because we don't want to see a turn toward heavier debt than producers are already managing right now.
Yeah, I'm old enough, I remember what the 1980 farm crisis looked like. I don't know if every producer can say that or not. But there's more and more characteristics that make me think that, it's setting up to be almost a very similar situation in what the 1980s was. I'm not going to say that's going to happen, but there's a lot of things that are similar to what happened back then.
Well, that'll be an insightful conversation when we talk about that new analysis. As always, you keep crunching the numbers, Gregg, on this and that. We appreciate you coming by and passing along the very latest.
All right, well, thanks.
He's Gregg Ibendahl. He is a farm management economist with K-State Research and Extension. And we'll be back with more on Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues. Now, some new information out of the College of Veterinary Medicine here at Kansas State University. Our guest has been, for a while now anyway, taking a look at the prospect of industrial hemp as a cattle feedstuff. It's something that may have some benefit, as we come to find, in taking the stress levels down in cattle. Mike Kleinhenz is with us. He is an assistant professor of beef production medicine in the College of Veterinary Medicine. Mike, welcome back.
Thank you for having me on.
Go back to the origins here. What prompted this work? Because, well, industrial hemp as a potential crop in Kansas has been proposed and explored in and of itself, right?
Yes, so this original work came from a USDA-funded grant I got with my collaborator, Dr. Hans Coetzee, in conjunction with Jason Griffin down by Wichita, who is our primary hemp grower. In the 2018 Farm Bill, industrial hemp was legalized for use as a production crop. And that kind of opened the door of, what do we do with industrial hemp? It's a nice green leafy plant. Can we use it as an animal feed type of a question? And currently, as it stands now, industrial hemp is not legal to be fed as an animal commodity. There are some groups actively pursuing that. I'm sure probably some people have read where industrial hemp seed meal specifically has been under the review of AFCO and the FDA, or the American Feed Controllers Association, for approval as an animal feed. And that's working its way through the process. So there are works in the way for it to be legalized, but we're a long ways away from that. But our work really started with answering the question of, if animals are exposed to industrial hemp, does it enter the body? How high does it enter? And does it have any impacts on those animals? And so this was just one of the lines of studies that we've been working on as part of that grant. And so for this study, we fed industrial hemp to a group of Holstein steers, and then we also had a control group where they didn't get an industrial hemp in their feed. I want to stress this was high cannabinoid industrial hemp. So we had a high amount of cannabinoids, specifically cannabidolic acid, which is the precursor to CBD. So you see in gummies and things like that outside pharmacies all over the place. There's a similar compound to that we fed to these cattle.
And your purpose here, again, was not to examine the nutritional value of hemp per se, as much as it was the basic health impacts. Right?
Exactly. So So our main goal was to see if we feed industrial hemp for multiple days, we wanted to see if there were any impacts in terms of stress. That's one of our big areas we work at in our lab, stress and inflammation. And so with this, we put accelerometers on the calves. So basically, we monitored how much time they spent laying around, the amount of steps they took in a day, and their overall general motion index. So how much activity they just had, moving left to right and things like that. We also took biomarkers for inflammation and stress, so cortisol for stress. And then for inflammation, we use prostaglandin, which is commonly blocked by things like ibuprofen or flunixin in cattle.
How much hemp were they fed per day or period?
So for this study, we fed them 25 grams of hemp. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but that was enough to get these big steers a dose of 5 milligrams per kilogram, which was some of our original work that we looked at, kind of looked like a nice target dose to get to. That's also the starting dose for a human CBD product for children with epilepsy. And so we kind of are sticking with that as our working dose at this current time.
With some sort of carrier, presumably?
So we found out real quick that cattle don't exactly find hemp flower to be very palatable. Right. And so we had to actually work on things like getting it mealed down a little bit from the flour. So I put it through a food processor essentially, and then that 25 grams of hemp was mixed with 200 grams of grain. So just your normal sweet feed you get at Tractor Supply or Orscheln's. And then we also top dressed it with just a little bit of molasses to really hide it. We got it down to a kind of a diet that those cattle would eat out of a individual feed pan on a pretty readily basis.
Again, you're looking at indicators that industrial hemp fed to these cattle might alleviate various forms of stress expressed in those cattle. What did you find out, Mike?
So, our big finding is that when we looked at their activity throughout the day, our industrial hemp calves spent a lot more time lying. And so that kind of shows us they're a little bit less stressful. And it was a complete inversion. So our groups, we monitored them about 4 days before we actually started feeding hemp. And our hemp calves actually spent less time lying, or had a little bit more activity. And as soon as we started feeding hemp, they started laying down a little bit more. And this was also supported by our cortisol results. So cortisol is a stress hormone. So if someone gets, standing in front of a crowd, that's that hormone that's released that kind of shows you stress. We can measure that in these animals, and our hemp-fed calves had lower stress cortisol throughout the whole study. And so we felt pretty comfortable that we had a nice stress reduction there.
And you mentioned the inflammation. That's part of the equation here, too, relieving them of certain physical stresses?
Yes. So we measured specifically prostaglandin. And so the prostaglandin we measured is specific for pain, essentially. And so we saw a reduction over time in our hemp-fed calves, where our control calves actually increased their prostaglandin production over the course of the study. And so saw a nice difference there as well.
How do you envision, potentially, if it's ever cleared for legal use, industrial hemp being employed as a feedstuff in cattle production systems?
The big hurdle will be figuring out how to deal with the cannabinoids. But once we can work on that, and we are actively pursuing some of that work right now, and we're close to having that analyzed. The next step would be to figure out where to use it. And so it's a couple of stress places where this would be useful because it has this stress reduction is in timing of like transportation, weaning, or any other health event that the animals find stressful, or we have knowledge that, it's stressful to these animals.
Are you going to continue to explore the feedstuff benefits of hemp then, Mike?
Yes, we are going to continue, actually. We actually have just wrapped up one study, and we're going to start another study hopefully this year looking at transportation and cannabinoids. And so we're actively pursuing that, as well as trying to figure out over the summer we're going to work on understanding the transference of cannabinoids in dairy cattle fed industrial hemp and how that enters into the milk. And at what levels, and when that milk could safely be consumed by consumers.
Still fleshing out answers, but you think this has a future?
By the looks of it, I think this very much does have a future, and especially if we can get industrial like hemp seed meal through the AFCO and FDA process. That's one avenue that we can open the doors and lower the barriers to get a lot of these into the system. And it does have quite a bit of potential. When you look at some of these byproducts, a lot of biomass is left over when they extract CBD oil. I get a lot of phone calls and, hey, I know someone has this. I want to feed it to my cattle. Can I? And I have to say no. But when we look at this, it has a really nice nutrient profile. 20% crude protein, looks to be digestible, and things like that. So there's a use for it. We just have to figure out where that use is and how to strategically use it in these animal systems.
Mike, you did want to, of course, capture the immediate impact on the animals and taking that stress down. But what about residual of the hemp substances here in the system of the animals?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. The main reason we really started this was to look at if we fed industrial hemp, especially high CBDA industrial hemp to cattle every day for 14 days, if that would accumulate in the system. And what we found is it doesn't appreciably accumulate. So we can mathematically measure that. And we found that the normal cannabinoids that we found in our first line of research are absorbed at the same levels in a similar pattern. And once we stopped feeding industrial hemp, we couldn't find it after 5 days in their plasma. Another thing I would like to hit on this is we also looked at how it impacted the animal's health. Obviously we did daily physical exams on them, but we also looked at their blood biomarkers for liver enzymes. And so there's some research out there that suggests, especially dogs that are given CBD oil every day, they might have some liver injury to those animals. And so we tested that, and we didn't find any differences between our control and our hemp-fed animals. And so we didn't find any evidence of any sort of liver injury. So it looks like this is pretty safe to feed to cattle on a daily basis at this dose.
Obviously, Mike, the crux of your work has been in cattle feeding. Could industrial hemp serve similar purposes in other livestock species?
Yes, that's actually one of the areas that it's called the Hemp Feed Coalition. They're working for getting hemp seed meal approved in laying hens, actually, is the animal species they're pursuing. Hopefully we'll have that. That's the one area where there is active pursuance of a approved feed ingredient. So it kind of depends on the plant part of, like all sorts of things. You don't feed a whole stalk of corn to pigs, but you'll have no problem feeding that ear. And so it's kind of a similar process with industrial hemp. So the seeds and things like that could readily be fed in any type of ruminant, monogastric pigs, chickens, things like that. The rest of the hemp plant could easily be fed in most ruminant species, sheep, goat, cattle. And so it's just a matter of finding where to use that and basically having the process got it figured into a ration and things like that.
Well, if the legal impediments can be cleared, then there is a body of information that really lends to the value of industrial hemp as a cattle feedstuff, in this case in alleviating stressful conditions and situations that the cattle may be going through. So we're looking forward to more from your laboratory on this very thing, Mike.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming by and telling us about your current work.
Thanks for having me on.
And he has been looking at, again, industrial hemp fed to Holstein steers in this case and the ensuing impacts on the stress levels in those cattle. Michael Kleinhenz is an assistant professor of beef production medicine out of the K-State College of Veterinary Medicine. Very interesting work indeed, and he's been passing it along to us on this part of Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
You were too kind.
That's Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Every now and then someone reacts to this program. It's either a question or just a comment. I remember at a talk I was giving, someone said, "Gus, I will never again abbreviate Kansas to just KS on an envelope." He had listened to the program when I remarked, "Our state is not KS, it's Kansas, and should always be written out fully." After last week's program reflecting on the article, "Taking Down the Old Barns," I got two responses. They were both from dear friends. Both are anthropologists and both are authors. Their comments mean a lot to me because they're serious and the issue is very close to my heart for Kansas. His comment was that I had been too lenient, and I'll quote, "You were too kind. If profit motives or the financial bottom line are more important than aesthetics or other cultural historical values, natural and traditional landscape would be and are sacrificed. There are other costs more difficult and often impossible to quantify, let alone calculate, but are to be considered for purposes of cultural heritage, beauty, etc. Historic preservation is not just about family values or memories about an old grandfather. I honestly think you have let a Kansan off the hook, and dare I say, missed an opportunity to drive home the importance of heritage stewardship, not just for future generations in one's own family, but the community at large, indeed humanity." End quote. My friends know that I want more for Kansas, not more in the sense what it does not have, but more of what it does have. I want people to understand and grasp and appreciate how unique our state is. It was interesting but not surprising to me that his wife reacted differently. And I quote again, "I read the essay differently than Harold. In fact, I thought you were saying just what Harold said you should, but doing it with tact, in the hope that folks might think twice before removing something that gives beauty and meaning to a landscape." End quote. If I had to do that program again, I would not change a thing I said. I only had so much time, and if I had more time, I could expand on the issue and my concerns for Kansas. I have responded to my friends. What is interesting is that in public meetings where I see people face to face, I have been much clearer in my message and will stress the point I want to make. The difference being that those who disagree can stand up and say so. They can face me and we can debate. We're in Kansas, and I do bring at times other values to the table. Values I strongly believe in, and I'm very willing to spread and explain for the benefit of our state. It is a fact that today's farms do need far greater space around sheds and buildings to operate. My hope is that this is not the end of the thought process.
Gus van Der Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. Our time's away once more, and as always, thanks to you for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.